tens of thousands of lives would have been saved, suffering reduced and the economic impact of COVID lessened if the UK had been better prepared for the pandemic. That is the damning conclusion of the official report from the 4-year-long COVID inquiry, which was released this afternoon. Baroness Hallett said the response was too little, too late, highlighting chaos at the heart of government and a failure to take the virus seriously in the first wave. She said then Prime Minister Boris Johnson presided over a toxic culture in Number 10, was too optimistic early on, and his special advisor, Dominic Cummings, poisoned the atmosphere. Relatives of those who died welcomed the criticism of Johnson, but said it was devastating to think lives would have been saved under a different PM. Well, Baroness Hallett also criticised the response of other UK governments, saying they failed to appreciate the scale of the threat and the urgency to act. We'll have more from our correspondents across the country on that in just a moment, but first, here's our political correspondent Romilly Weeks on the damning findings.
The way ahead is hard, and it is still true that many lives will, sadly, be lost.
They were those at the top during the dark days of the pandemic, and they don't all come out of this report well. 4.5 years since Boris Johnson set up the COVID inquiry, its chair sums up the UK's COVID response in one devastating sentence.
Too little, too late. There was a serious failure by all 4 governments to appreciate the level of risk and the calamity that the UK faced, and the need to inject urgency into the response.
The report identifies crucial decision-making delays. In February 2020, as COVID spread around the world, the plan the Health Secretary had promised did not actually exist, and Boris Johnson was still boasting of shaking hands. Baroness Hallett concluded an earlier lockdown in England alone could have saved over 20,000 lives, so painful for bereaved families to hear.
We now know that many of our family members would still be alive today if it wasn't for the leadership of Boris Johnson and his colleagues.
The report points to the culture in Number 10 being a particular problem. The rule-breaking parties, whilst the country endured lockdowns, undermined public confidence. And furious WhatsApps like this between the then Prime Minister and Dominic Cummings describing the Health Secretary as totally expletive, hopeless, were among reams of evidence of a toxic, chaotic culture at the centre of government. But the devolved administrations also face strong criticism. In Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, they also failed to act fast enough or collaborate effectively with central government. And the complexity of rules across the 4 nations made it difficult for the public to follow.
It has the enormous strength of being able to look back across the whole of the period, across the whole of the United Kingdom, to draw out things from the perspective it has that simply weren't available to us at the time.
We were not too reliant on the UK government in the sense that we were happy just to leave the decisions to it. That certainly was not the case on my part. But in point of fact, we were reliant on the UK government to do certain things because we didn't have the power to do them at our own hand.
As for the most vulnerable groups in society, Baroness Hallett says too little thought was given to the impact of school closures on children's education and mental health. And although disabled people, some ethnic minority groups and the elderly were at higher risk, this was given too little attention. Jean Adamson lost her father.
It makes me feel very sad, disappointed. I feel let down by Boris Johnson's government.
The report runs to a huge 800 pages, and for all of this not to be in vain, and all of the loss and heartbreak not to be repeated, Baroness Hallett makes a series of recommendations, including that the impact of decisions on the most vulnerable is better considered, that emergency powers are scrutinised by Parliament, that decisions are more clearly communicated to the public, and communications between all 4 nations are improved. Now it's up to politicians in there to make sure it actually happens. Keir Starmer has said tonight that there had been improvements already in the way the government would respond to a major crisis and promised to consider all the recommendations. As for Boris Johnson, he has, so far, remained silent. Romilly Weeks, ITV News.
Well, let's get more now on the failures of all UK governments. Our Scotland correspondent, Peter Smith, is in Edinburgh. Our Wales reporter, Rhys Williams, is in Cardiff. And UTV's Deborah McAleese is in Belfast. And first to Peter, what did the report highlight?
Effectively, Scotland had no strategy for decision-making at all from January to March in 2020, and it puts Scotland's very prominent leader at that time, Nicola Sturgeon, under the spotlight, praising her as a serious and diligent leader, but also saying that she kept a really small circle of trust that excluded some ministers and advisors. Now, Nicola Sturgeon referred to this small circle as her gold command, making big decisions effectively behind closed doors because there were no minutes kept for it. And of course, we now know that Nicola Sturgeon has deleted the bulk of her WhatsApp messages from that time. Big decisions, such as the decision to close Scotland schools, made effectively just between Nicola Sturgeon and John Swinney. Now, Nicola Sturgeon has defended her approach, saying she was right to be on the front foot and saying that she was taking responsibility. But some criticism today from the bereaved families in Scotland, saying that Nicola Sturgeon's slick presidential style is no substitute for substance when it comes to lives lost.
At some parts, this report has been quite kind to the Welsh Government. Baroness Hallett says she didn't find any issues with the culture or leadership of the Welsh Government. In the main, though, it is a damning critique of another government that simply wasn't prepared for this kind of pandemic. The report points out that while ministers were being advised to draw up plans for Nightingale-style wards, mass gatherings were continuing in Cardiff, with 2 big Stereophonics gigs going ahead. The Welsh Government also failed to intervene to postpone a rugby match between Wales and Scotland during the Six Nations. It was the Welsh Rugby Union who eventually called it off. Mark Drakeford told the inquiry at the time that he was expecting the UK government to make all the big decisions in the preparation for COVID. And while Baroness Hallett says that's understandable, it didn't remove the Welsh government's responsibility to recognise the severity of COVID and to prepare earlier. This report has been criticised strongly by the bereaved families here in Wales, who actually say that it doesn't go far enough and writes Wales out of its own tragedy, offering not enough challenge or accountability for the thousands of lives lost.
Well, it's unsurprising that political divisions and dysfunction at the very heart of Stormont during this pandemic was mentioned several times in this report. Now, Baroness Hallett said that some political leaders here in Northern Ireland were not always able to set aside their political and sectarian divisions and govern jointly, and some allowed their political interests to inform their decision making, and this led to chaotic decision making around things like school closures, lockdowns and circuit breakers. Now, there was also criticism of the current First Minister, Michelle O'Neill, for attending a very high profile Republican funeral in June 2020, but there was also criticism of the former First Minister, Arlene Foster, for her inappropriate use of cross-community votes to make political points. Now, some bereaved families went to London today, and this has all reopened old wounds, knowing that political divisions led to many mistakes being made here.
All right, Deborah, Rhys and Peter, thank you all very much. Well, the failure to handle the pandemic was particularly devastating for care homes, where 20,000 people died in England in just 3 months in the first outbreak. It had a big impact on schools too, with today's report saying pupils suffered greatly from the lockdowns and childhood came to a halt for millions. And tens of thousands of businesses folded as a result of the lockdowns. Our correspondent Geraint Vincent heard the real-world impact of the decisions made during the pandemic.
We had to shut down the business purely because of financial reasons, having to take out the loans. It all added up, lots of pressure.
Running his own restaurant was Henal Chotai's lifelong dream. He opened it 5 years before COVID hit, but the pandemic made his business no longer viable.
Having no information at hand, we all had to just make decisions on the spur of the moment, not knowing whether we were open one day, closed the next day. And with hospitality, we cater with food, and those are things that you can't just put away in the cupboard and use 2 weeks later. They're very perishable goods.
I just remember those first 2 weeks of the lockdown, which was prior to the Easter holidays, we were scratching our heads thinking, what do we do next? And it was just a really, really impossible time.
Lockdowns left lasting scars, says the inquiry report, not least on those just starting out on the journey of life.
At that point where they're into secondary school and they're growing up and they're finding their feet and they're growing into young adults at that point in time, suddenly they're in lockdown, can't interact socially after school anymore, then in another lockdown, and I think that really started to manifest itself in expecting students to be done for them. So I think resilience had started to disappear, emotional resilience started to disappear. You just wish we could have got to a policy and stuck to a policy, and that would have helped not just schools, but I think it would have helped everything.
Once COVID got into the home, it was horrific. We lost 17 people in 2 weeks. I don't think the number needed to have been that high.
Those responsible for helping people through the other end of life's journey had similar experiences. Government policy was often unclear, and when it was clear, it felt wrong.
I think as a sector, we were abandoned. I think we were left to fend for ourselves. The guidance was overly harsh. You know, the last person that you should be with at the end of your life, it shouldn't be a carer. It shouldn't be one of us. It should have been that person's family. That I think people have the right to that, and I think that was denied to them.
The advantages of hindsight have often been cited by government ministers in defence of their decisions, but 5 years ago the results of their muddled response to the pandemic could be clearly seen by people who had simply to press on as best they could. Geraint Vincent, ITV News.
Our political editor, Robert Peston, is here. Robert, Boris Johnson still has many supporters. Some would like to see him make a comeback one day. What chance of that now, do you think?
So look, it's important to explain what Baroness Hallett's 800-page report has described. It is no less than the greatest failure by any British government, by the British state of our lifetimes. And it's not just her conclusion that if we'd locked down only a week earlier, 23,000 lives would have been saved. The description of how the Prime Minister simply didn't take the virus seriously until it was upon us, that February was a wasted month, when here at ITV we were showing those pictures of chaos in Italy, you know, people sleeping in wards, the deaths in Italy, and yet somehow there wasn't the urgency in government that was required. And then, you know, Rishi Sunak's Eat Out to Help Out scheme described as ill-conceived. There were recommendations there should have been a circuit-breaking lockdown to slow the halt in the autumn, which again the government failed to do. And then there's a whole variety of further mistakes that she said she made until we were through the worst of all of this. Now, lots of individuals criticised a toxic culture in Downing Street, which they attribute to the Prime Minister's chief advisor, Dominic Cummings. He has angrily rebutted that tonight. But throughout all of this, the person in charge was Boris Johnson as Prime Minister. He's not said anything tonight, but I have to say, on the basis of what I regard as I say, the most damning critique of failure by any government of modern times, I don't see how he has any hope of a comeback.
All right, Robert, there have been lots more to discuss off the back of this report. Thank you so much.